So is anyone here a fan of Downton Abbey? Are you willing to show your hands? Have you seen the movie that was just recently released? Anyone? Waiting on your list to do? Having grown up with an awareness of my British roots, not of the Grantham lineage type, but certainly not too distant generationally, my birth mother actually was born and raised in just outside of London, England, and just emigrated here in the late 50s after spending some time trying to adjust to post-war living in Britain. But I've always had an interest in things British, not unlike its predecessor, Upstairs, Downstairs. Downton Abbey follows the lives of both those who are Lord and Lady of Downton and the multiple staff who served them. And throughout the various plots of the multiple season series and movie, there is always this underlying tension between the servant and the master. There was a clear hierarchy of rule both upstairs and downstairs. Strict rules of place and position were adhered until, horror of horrors, in the first season, the daughter of the manor took up with the chauffeur. Seasons later, Tom Branson's character is the son-in-law of Lord Grantham, and women like Lady Edith are working independently, and it is harder and harder to hire staff since World War I. Men and women in service realized they had other opportunities, so they began to seek education and training in fields that took them out of the basement or attics of the manor houses and into the offices and trades of the city. Interesting to me was the tension not just between upstairs and downstairs, masters and servants, but among each class as they held position and place even within their own hierarchical role. And in the recent movie, it is the opportunity to host the King and Queen of England that sends all into a frenzy at Downton. Not everyone is excited to be hosting the royal couple, as they don't believe in their status above all others, and yet some can barely contain their enthusiasm, so honored are they to think that they will serve their king and queen. The place of master and servant was the theme of our gospel reading this morning. Hospitality plays a role in first century Israel, in 20th century Britain, and even today. Master, you wash my feet? Peter exclaims. Master, I wash your feet? Others might cry. The switching of roles, the radical hospitality Jesus modeled, and the ingrained sense of master and servant was being challenged. I've shared with you other stories of my Camino experience, but when my daughter and Amanda and I were on the Camino, we were about 4 or 5 days in, and let me tell you, we were tired and we were sore. Our feet were blistered, our legs ached, muscles we didn't even know existed in our bodies, we discovered. We walked with limps, and it was hard to get out of bed in the morning, we were so stiff. We had made it as far as Navarre, where we checked into the Casa Magica, and yes, it was magical. It was a nondescript building from the outside, whitewashed stucco with a beat-up plastic chair under a faded awning out front next to a broken pop machine. And as we entered to get out of the sweltering heat and sun, we walked through a plastic door covering that hung like a 70s fringe curtain and found ourselves in a cool, dark place with potted greenery, beautifully designed stone floors in intricate patterns, and antique chairs and tables. The reception desk was occupied by a gracious gentleman who checked us in and informed us of all the services available to us. Besides the home-cooked meal, washing facilities, and backyard courtyard complete with foot bathing pools, lounge chairs, and shaded hammocks, we could sign up for a massage. We were in heaven, or in Camino terms, Casa Magica. We signed up for the foot massage, and later that afternoon were treated tenderly and with such care as our feet were soaked in Epsom salts, our blisters were re-threaded, and we were given a light kiss on the forehead by the priest-like gentleman that made us feel like we had been blessed. It felt indeed like Jesus washing our feet and blessing us himself. It had become obvious to me that as we ventured on the Camino, that we literally walked in the footsteps of hundreds of thousands of pilgrims who had gone before us. Most of the towns and villages we walked through had bridges over waterways that took us into each town, and many signs directed us to the local pharmacies, hospitals, or accommodations for pilgrims, pretty much in that order. It had not always been that way. Early pilgrims headed out on the 700-kilometer journey from all parts of Europe with nothing but a cloak if they were lucky and perhaps a gourd to carry the day's water. They relied on the hospitality of strangers along the way. It was far from safe. If you were fortunate enough to have a pair of sandals, you would likely be a target for a thief to steal them in the night. If you were lucky, you'd survive the attack, but not all did, for a pair of sandals. Some towns could only be reached by crossing some river, and until bridges were built, many pilgrims who were non-swimmers drowned trying to make that crossing. Some did travel by horse, but most were poor peasants who made the journey on behalf of another, hoping to gain some favor from the church or for God to heal a loved one, to ensure a faithful one's entrance to heaven, or make payment in some form of penance. Some could be away for years, as they often had to stop and work somewhere to pay for their way forward. And of course, no cell phones to call back home and let people know that you're all right. Others had to beg or rely on the generosity and kindness of others. And many took their role of host or hostess to these pilgrims as an expression of their own faith. And many churches were erected along the path, in fact, to provide shelter and food to those who traveled along the Camino. Hospitality. It was both a blessing and, in many cases, life-saving. Traveling the Camino in the 21st century is quite different. I would say that because we are accustomed to such privilege and comfort, that the challenge was actually to live more simply and to undergo some harsher conditions than what we were used to. How we would endure the physical demands of walking by foot all the way in kinds of weather and do it all without our normal creature comforts. I've never been as grateful for the hospitality of strangers as I was during that pilgrimage. And sometimes I even relate when I'm walking down the streets of Guelph or across a park and I see folk who have spent the night under a blanket, under the shelter of a picnic table, or huddled up next to a grocery cart that they use to carry their worldly goods. And that brings me back to that sense of pilgrimage and how many in our world live just day to day in those kinds of circumstances. The greater the fatigue and pain I experienced, the greater the blessing and grace of the kindness of a stranger that I received, whether they offered us refreshment, food, shelter, and in some cases first aid, even the washing of our feet. Fellow travelers were generous with their Band-Aids and blister creams. I felt far more compassionate and kind the further we traveled, as my sense of appreciation for others' kindness towards me sunk in, and my own ability to offer the same to others grew as we walked day by day. There was no hierarchy among pilgrims. We all served one another. They say in order to understand another person's life, you must walk in their shoes. And I felt that I walked in the very steps of so many, and I often thought of Jesus' actions both in washing the disciples' feet and speaking of how when you offer hospitality to another, you could in fact be offering hospitality to angels unawares. Jesus said, "Make sure you get this right. Receiving someone I send is the same as receiving me, just as receiving me is the same as receiving the one who sent me." Now, to be honest, I'm not sure what is more difficult. Is it the giving of hospitality or the receiving? of hospitality. How many of you would say it feels easier or more comfortable to offer hospitality? How many of you feel comfortable receiving hospitality? Not so much. Regardless of whether we are in the position of being servant to another or free in our offering of hospitality, what we offer in the spirit of hospitality, I believe, is significant. It is an act of faith. It is a belief in the value and the worthiness of another. It is an acknowledgement that we cannot be solely self-reliant. We need the support and care of others at different times in our lives, and that is so countercultural to how we live today. I realize that I find it easier to offer hospitality, because in order to receive hospitality, I would have to admit my own vulnerability. And like Peter, I might be the one to protest another doing for me what I feel I should be doing for myself. Just talk to my children, and they would tell you that that is so. It is hard to accept from another. It is difficult to admit our own vulnerability. And yet that is the kind of grace that we are offered each and every day in our lives of faith. And it is something that, as followers of Christ, we are asked to offer one another. Ultimately, it is an act of faith, the hospitality that we offer one another, be it stranger or friend, a family member. Jesus modeled that kind of hospitality and care to each one of us. Receiving someone I send is the same as receiving me, just as receiving me is the same as receiving the one who sent me. It is indeed a blessing both to give and to receive the gift of hospitality. Amen.